Welcome to MedHeads, the weekly show that brings a biopsychosocial focus to issues of the day, along with special guests who will showcase their expertise and enthusiasm about their field of practice. Your host, Dr. Fergal Armstrong.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong and welcome to this episode of MedHeads. We have our regular guest Craig Payne and our special guest Oscar Grano with us today. How are you both?
Very well. Thanks, Fergal.
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Fergal?
I'm good. So I thought today we'd talk about desperation and willingness. And Oscar, I've heard you speak eloquently in the past on this subject. And one of the things that you've said is the gift of desperation. Tell me, Oscar, what you mean by the gift of desperation.
Well, what I mean by the gift of desperation is that more often than not, people who are suffering from addiction will often not do what it really takes to make the change necessary to actually get into recovery until they're so desperate that they feel they have no other choice. So it's from that desperation, the desperation is what leverages them into actually making significant enough changes in their lives to be able to get recovery. And it's often that unless somebody feels they have no other choice, and they feel like what they're doing is not working, will they attempt to do something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you use the word gift. I mean, I remember, in fact, I spoke to someone on a couple of days ago, and he was actually a pharmacist that had gone into med school, and he'd finished his med school training, and he'd almost finished his intern year, and then he got found out because he was using or misusing prescription drugs. And he was telling me his story, and he said to me, near the end of his story, he said, you know what, it was actually the best thing that happened to me that I got caught. Mm-hmm. And he spoke of it in very positive terms. So that rock bottom, that transition, that it does create the desperation wherein people, or whereby people really do need to make a change. And that change is for the better, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. Craig, what do you think about that? What do you think about the gift of desperation?
Yeah, well, it's a place of fear that opens, as Oscar said, that opens the doorway to finally making change, because sometimes you don't know if you're going to make it back from that point where you're finally willing to try anything.
Sorry, Craig, you dropped out. We'll have to cut back to you.
Yeah, okay.
I'll ask the question again.
Yeah.
So, Craig, what do you think about the gift of desperation?
Yeah, it's exactly that. And, it's that place, as Oscar said, where you're finally willing to make change and to start to listen to new ideas. Sometimes it's born from a place of fear sometimes too, where you're afraid that maybe you don't come back from the next one. Yeah.
That fear that the next time could be your last time, is that an issue for people going into recovery, Oscar? The next time could be the last time?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think it's different for everybody. I think that some people who are in denial can be in denial about how serious it is. And I've seen a lot of people who are in that kind of place end up passing away from it because they haven't come to grips with the reality of how serious it is. And I suppose the hope is that people realize how serious it is before it gets to that point, because that's the reality of it.
I mean, one of the things that I've seen and heard and read about is the fact that this idea of rock bottom in the context of someone with addiction has to really be rock bottom, because remember that patients with addictions, their lives are full of pain and misery and suffering. So that daily pain, misery and suffering or rather, the rock bottom has to be even worse than the daily pain and misery and suffering for there to be some kind of positive gain in it. Is that, am I off the mark? What do you guys think about that? Oscar first.
Again, it's different for everybody. Some people will fall really hard and really fast, and other people will exist in a state of which you're speaking, where it's just, I've heard people say that they lived in a rock bottom for a long time before they got into recovery. And I think the way that people define that is entirely different. And also what it takes for people is entirely different, and what lengths people have to go to realize that, it's time to find another way is completely different. Yeah.
Craig, what do you think? What do you think about the misery of daily life compared to rock bottom?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, as Oscar said, because for some people it becomes that comfort zone, and living in that becomes normality, and you can survive, and if you haven't got much, if you haven't got anything, then not much can get to you either, so but once you start to realize it can be finally that place where you start to do it for yourself, and it's a real motivator for change in that sense, and in some ways needs to be grasped onto and held onto and not forgotten, because, and even I think it's one of the things that leads to relapse is forgetting what it gets like too, and you think, oh, maybe I can control again. In a little bit of time, when things improve, you think, oh, it can send you back to that control method. So really remembering what it is and where it takes you. Sometimes it can take a few falls before you really start to listen to, well, that's where it's going to take me every time.
But what do you think about the idea that for some people, the fear of their next hit being their last hit is meaningless because their lives are such misery? And how do you deal with that, Craig?
Yeah, it's a hard one. And I suppose it's where you start to look at trying to get some self-esteem building and starting to look at circumstances and hoping to find some meaning in their life for them, or in a future for them, and start to show that there is hope out there. And I think, and that's what being around other addicts and alcoholics can do. So
the idea that you've got to uplift yourself, when you're at rock bottom, when you uplift yourself, when you turn that corner, you've got to ascend through all the misery that you descended through originally. So the only way that you can have the strength to do that is, as you say, then to achieve those or establish those connections with people who've been there, done that, and there to provide you with unconditional kindness. Now, Oscar, you've used the phrase unconditional kindness to me before. So what do you think about that idea? What is it that gives people, how do you help people who don't care if their next hit is their last hit? How do you help them?
Well, I think it really comes down to asking them if they've had enough, and trying to get into a place with somebody where you can just be quite frank about it, and if somebody decides that they've had enough and that they want to find another way, then that's great. We can explore stuff. We can have that conversation. We can start to look at what does that look like for you, for the individual. But if somebody isn't ready for that, then they're not ready for it, and nothing can force them to be ready for it. But the thing within that as well is that there are support groups which are not abstinence based as well, where people who are still in a place where they're unsure whether they need complete abstinence or whether they still want to try and control it in some way, that they can still go and they can try and work on those short-term goals and use that as a stepping stone towards the journey of discovering what lengths they need to go to get the quality of life that they want. So there's something for everyone, no matter what kind of stage they're at, I think.
So, Oscar, these non-abstinence-based support groups, how freely accessible are they? And, why haven't people heard about them more than they perhaps ought to? How do you find them?
Well, with the groups that I'm referring to, the only place that I've really heard about them myself is through services. I haven't seen them advertised, and yeah, they are open community groups, but a lot of them are run, in and by services as well. So I'd say, maybe if somebody hadn't engaged with services before, they might not have heard of them.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose it's another way of thinking that it's kind of almost like a peer-led or peer-supported AOD counselling, because the whole concept of AOD counselling is that you accept where the person is, and then you gradually work on making small but incremental changes in that person's drug use. So harm reduction very much is the core to that. Would you agree, Craig?
Yeah, and I think, look, on a couple of points that have been raised there, it's important to remember that not everyone wants the help that we perceive they need necessarily, or yeah, and they're just not ready for it. But definitely easing into these support programs and easing into ideas of change can really take time. For some people, this life is ingrained, and and it's really hard to start to turn around those values and start to turn around those goals and what they're looking forward at.
So that's an interesting point, Craig, that you've made, that rock bottom actually can take time, and the change and the change in course can be years. You've said that people live in rock bottom for a long time, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I think, and this is the thing, is it's not the gateway. Well, it's a gateway to change, but it's more the gateway to opening up the idea of change.
Yeah.
And again, it's going to take time to reinforce. Again, it's going to take time to explore with people and find out what change looks like for them.
Yeah. So they get to dip their toe in the water and they get to see how other people have managed the situation that they're in. But it's not the beginning of the end. It's not the end of it, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
No, well, I mean, it's a new way of living. It's a new way of looking at life, and so this takes time to turn around. Your thought processes, your emotions, all this stuff just doesn't change overnight. Just because you're finally willing and you're desperate enough for it doesn't mean that it's going to happen straight away, and doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to understand or easy to grasp.
Yeah. And there's a lot of fear there, isn't there? It's very scary. It's a scary place to be in, as you've said before, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. Fear of the unknown, living a life completely differently, giving up on the old ideas, giving up on friends, family, or environment, certain people, all this sort of stuff, and and just looking after you again. It's a scary space to hold.
So, Oscar, do you find that fear interacts with desperation, and that there's a battle between the two emotions? And if the fear wins, then people don't progress in recovery. If the desperation wins, then people do progress in recovery. Is that something that you would identify with?
Yes and no. I think it's the fear that you experience within the desperation which can also propel you to make the change. Because, it's yes, there's the fear of change, but there's also the fear of living the way that I'm living, and the place that this has gotten me to has become so terrifying that I'm going to do whatever it takes to find another way so I don't have to live this way anymore. So I think it can work both ways.
Right. And what do you think about that, Craig?
Yeah, and not forgetting it. I think that's the big one is, as things do start to change, as things do start to progress, it's easy for that desperation and willingness to subside, and you start to figure out if the drive is actually a real internal drive to change and it's actually coming from you, or whether it was just the fact that you found yourself in a different situation with no way out, and so making some change was it. And and then things start to change and do start to get a little bit better. and that fear subsides. And so it's not there anymore, and it's not driving you. And so always remembering what that is, and how low it can take you. It's that thing of, my past will my past will, it'll remind me but not define me. So
I
not
like
getting
that.
lost in
Yes.
that stuff. And we need these constant. Well, I think in a lot of cases you need the constant reminders to point out where it can take you again. So when you start to look at these things, you start to think, oh, maybe it's a good idea, or maybe I can just do it once again, and maybe I can start to integrate it using back into my life.
Yeah.
Got to remember where it's going to take you and how quickly it can take you there.
So my past will remind me, but it will not define me. Oscar, tell me something about that. What does that speak to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And even in my own recovery, because we definitely have a tendency to have selective memory,
Yeah.
and, for me, it's very important to be around people who are in early recovery and who are struggling with this stuff. So I get a constant reminder of, what the reality could become if I were to pick up again. Even though, I've been in recovery for over a decade, but that reminder is still important. And it's also important when working with people to remind them that, we're constantly saying, write stuff down, write down how you're feeling, keep a journal,
Yeah.
to remind yourself of what these early days were like. So you can look back at that, see how far you've come, and see why you don't want to go back there.
Yeah. Yeah. So moving on, Craig, I've heard you say the phrase frequently that it's recovery begins when your mouth shuts and your ears open. To what extent does desperation and willingness play into that concept?
It's essential. It's one thing to sit there and to have people tell you things, and people can tell you things over and over again. But if you're not listening and you're not actually going to enforce that and make these changes in your life, then it's just pointless. And again, it's that thing where the back's against the wall, and maybe you've tried everything, you've tried everything that you think will work, but then you're finally willing to shut up and try things that other people are telling you has worked for them, and to just give it a go. That there's the sick and tired of being sick and tired. Are you actually sick and tired of? Because if you are, that's where you'll start to do things. And and instead of arguing, instead of talking back, instead of trying to justify why things won't work for you, you'll just do it and see where it goes.
Yeah, and that's personally for me as a therapist, I find it very frustrating trying to help people who are at that point where they know that they've got a problem, they know they've got to seek my help. And then when I get to the point of recommending that they start engaging in peer support groups, that's when the back chat comes to me and there's, I'm different, I don't need it, I can do it on my own, or there's no, I don't want to be part of it because, they don't understand me. And I tell them, look, these are groups where you might not, if you stay long enough, eventually you'll hear what you need to hear. And, the groups are all characterized in the various ways by unconditional kindness, and they're all going to accept you. Dealing with that person in that stage where there's still the back chat, where the mouth is still open and the ears aren't open yet, and they haven't got to the point where they're so desperate that they are actually willing to give it a go. For me as a therapist is quite challenging, because I can see that they're almost there. They just need to take a few more steps. But unless they take those steps, they're just not going to get better, because one thing that I try and tell my patients is, even though I can prescribe them medication to help them, unless they start dealing with their issues in their life that drove them towards their substance use, they're not going to make it. So for me, that stage when their mouth is still open and their ears are shut, to me is a challenge. I mean, would you identify with that, Oscar, in your group work?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly challenging when,
Yeah,
people, yeah, when, like you're saying, when they're seeking help and they know that something needs to change, but then, when it comes to the crunch, it's like they're not really willing to change much at all. And
yeah,
um, one thing that is good about the position that I'm in, as a peer support worker, is I'm able to just sit in a space with somebody where they are
yeah,
and try to maintain some kind of connection. And I'm
yeah,
able to go, we can be in this space and we can be in this space on your terms. And, I've had relationships with people that have lasted a long period of time. And in the beginning, they're not willing to really change much at all. But just by keeping that door open to that connection, it
yeah.
means that when they are ready to start exploring things and exploring a greater level of change, that they've got that pathway to do it.
And I suppose it alludes to the fact that it's the engagement actually that is the beginning of the therapeutic process. And so long as they are engaging
Mm.
at some level, then there is actually hope for change. What do you think about that, Craig? How
Yeah,
frustrating do
and
you find it to deal with patients in that situation?
well, I think it demonstrates the value of shared experience, and it's where peer workers are so valuable again. Um, but it's that thing, if you can't help someone, if they're not willing to help themselves and they're not willing to look at new ideas, and so you can keep just sharing experiences, you can keep um, sending messages of hope, and just but also trying to explore the idea of why they don't think it works for them and what makes them so different to the other people that are there. I was having a
Yeah,
conversation with a guy the other day who had gone through a couple of different groups and tried things, but in his view he wasn't one of those losers that was there.
yes,
And it can be hard when the story that they're telling you reflects something completely different. Like that
yeah,
they not, yeah, and it's not the loser tag, but it's the thing that's where you fit in, because that's where your drinking is taking you, that's where your using is
yeah.
taking you.
I,
And
I
if people aren't
often
willing to accept that,
I often find that people's concept of the uniqueness of their experience is a barrier to them accessing treatment. They're different. They don't need the same kind of help that everyone else does, or their suffering is different, and they're beyond redemption, or they're not as bad. Um,
yeah, and I think
and
people try and listen. It's a thing that's said quite often is, like, listen to the similarities and not the differences.
yeah,
And yeah, because
yeah,
it's really easy to walk in there, and I think that's what desperation and willingness start to do,
yeah,
is because if you're not really looking for that change, if your mind's still closed to the ideas, you're going to walk in there and your mind's just going to put up defense mechanisms, and it's gonna say, yeah, but I'm different and I'm this, and this won't work for me, and you'll only hear that. But once the mouth shuts and the ears open, the message can start to filter through a little bit better, and you do start to hear the similarities, and that's where people can begin some positive change and start to
absolutely,
identify, and
absolutely,
then who knows how long it takes from there.
yeah. So desperation is actually the key driver, the key engine to overcoming those barriers of the sense of identity and the uniqueness, and to getting the mouth shut and the ears opening, isn't it? And have you seen that in your practice, Oscar? Have you seen how desperation has changed people into becoming more receptive?
100%. 100%.
Yeah.
Um, Especially at the moment during the coronavirus, I'm seeing a much higher percentage of people which, once they're arriving in detox, are in a much more desperate place, a much more desperate and willing place.
Yeah.
So at the moment, because of how much more difficult it is out there, it's actually become easier to work with a higher percentage of people at the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that also speaks to the fact, when people with their loved ones and people that are close to them, how they're encouraged to not enable their loved ones who are in addiction. It's because by enabling people, you're actually hindering them from reaching that rock bottom.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a backwards concept for some people to grasp, but you know, when you look at it like that, I think it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah. And Oscar, I've heard you say before this idea that you need to surrender to win. Could you explain what that means, and how does desperation fit into surrendering to win?
Well, it's basically just the fact that, so, you know, me on my own with my unguided decision making has made me end up in this place of rock bottom. So I need to surrender my own thinking, or, you know, my own will, and I need to be open to be guided by something else, you know, something else that is loving and caring and that's able to help me, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And Craig, would you identify with that, surrendering to win?
Yeah, and what's running through my mind with that is the phrase that I hear a lot. And I had to be completely broken down so that I could rebuild.
Yes.
You know, and just lose sight of all the old ideas, and lose sight of what they thought would work for themselves. So,
And how does desperation fit into that, do you think, Craig?
because you have been broken down, there's nothing left. You've sort of lost everything at that point.
Yeah.
And physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, you know, it's just bankrupt as far as it all goes.
Yeah.
And so it is a rebuilding process. It is a starting again, and it's almost like, it's a great space to be in, because you've got nothing left to lose. So why the fuck not give it a shot? You know?
Why not? Why not? All right. So look, on that sweet note, we're going to have to wrap things up. So I want a final summary message from both of you. So, Oscar, what final point would you like to make on the subject of desperation and willingness?
Just the fact that, you know, if you find yourself in a place where you're in that complete and utter desperation, hold on to it, and, you know, you use it to propel into change, and never lose sight of what that was like.
Yeah. And Craig, what would you say? One final point to make.
Yeah, no matter how bad things get, hope always exists, and just keep fighting.
Keep fighting. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, your pearls of wisdom. I look forward to the next time we meet. Thank you. That's all for today's MedHeads. My name's Dr. Fergal Armstrong. We'll see you next time.